It's a chilly morning in Cincinnati on October 6, 1927. The leaves in Eden Park are just beginning to turn crimson and gold. Sunlight filters through the trees along the winding roads of one of the city's most elegant green spaces. A taxi with a stylish woman and her young daughter inside rattles along Victoria Parkway, heading towards the courthouse downtown. The woman is Augusta Imogene Remus. She was once the queen of the city's most extravagant parties. Now she's on her way to finalize a divorce from the man who made her rich beyond imagination. Beside her sits her teenage daughter, Ruth. Suddenly, a large limousine pulls up behind her with tires squealing. It's moving fast. The driver of the taxi tenses up while glancing in the rearview mirror. The pursuing vehicle swerves, a horn blares, and tires screech. Imogene looks back, her face draining of color. She knows exactly who's chasing her. The limo slams into the taxi, forcing it off the road near the Springhouse gazebo. A short, stocky man in a dark suit leaps out with a pearl-handled revolver in his hand. He charges towards her, and Imogene bolts from the cab, her daughter Ruth screaming behind her. He catches up to her, grabs her wrist, and yanks her around. She pleads, "Don't hurt me, Daddy. You know I love you. Don't do it, don't do it." His eyes are wild with rage. A single shot rings out. He shot her with the gun that he once gave her for her protection. Imogene Remus drops to the ground. She's been shot in the abdomen. The blood soaks her black dress. Park visitors freeze in horror. Children playing nearby stop and scream. The shooter doesn't run. He walks calmly back to the road, flags down a motorist in a dark green Studebaker, and says, with the unmistakable German accent, "Take me to the Central Station." George Remus calmly walks inside police headquarters. He stands before Chief Detective Emmett Kurgan and declares, "Lock me up. I've just shot my wife." While pacing in his cell, he had something that chills the room. She who dances down the primrose path must die on the primrose path. I'm happy. This is the first peace of mind I've had in 2 years. The man who pulled the trigger that morning was George Remus, once called the King of Bootleggers. He was a self-made multimillionaire who had controlled a staggering share of America's illegal liquor during Prohibition. How did a respected Chicago lawyer and pharmacist become the biggest bootlegger in the country, only to be destroyed by the one person he trusted most? This is a true story of betrayal and a public act of revenge that shocked the nation. To understand why, we have to go back a few years, to the moment when George Remus decided the law was no longer something he would practice, but something he would beat. Let's take a walk, and I'll tell you the story. George Remus was born November 14, 1878, in Landsberg, Germany. Back then, it was known as the German Empire. His family immigrated to the United States in 1882 when he was a small boy, and eventually they settled in Chicago. By the age of 14, he was working in his uncle's pharmacy to support his family after his father could no longer work. He was the breadwinner. He graduated from the Chicago College of Pharmacy at the age of 19. He opened his first drugstore at 21. Eventually, he grew tired of the business, so in his mid-20s, he studied law at the Illinois College of Law, passed his bar exam in 1904, and he built a thriving criminal defense practice, especially murder cases. He earned the nickname Crying Remus for his tear-filled, emotional pleas that moved juries. In 1914, he pioneered what would later be called the temporary insanity defense in the high-profile William Cheney Ellis murder trial of his wife Eleanor in 1914. It took place in Chicago. George argued that overwhelming emotions could drive a sane man to temporary madness. The idea would come back to haunt him and save him. By 1920, George Remus was earning around $500,000 a year, roughly $8 million in today's money, but something bigger was happening. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act took effect. Prohibition had begun. George watched his bootlegger clients getting rich while he defended them. He saw poorly educated gangsters making fortunes because the law had created a vacuum. And George, the pharmacist and lawyer, memorized every line of the Volstead Act. He found the loopholes almost immediately, and he realized he could do it better. The law allowed the legal production of whiskey under the government permits for medicinal purposes only. Doctors could prescribe it, pharmacies could dispense it, and all it took was the right license, the right purchase, and the right creative distribution. George sold his law practice. He divorced his first wife, Lillian, and he married his mistress, Augusta Imogene Holmes. She was a striking young divorcee with a daughter named Ruth. They married in Newport, Kentucky in June of 1920. In the early days of his new venture, George didn't break the law. He bought entire distilleries with his own money and government approval. Then he moved the entire operation to Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati? Well, within a 300-mile radius lay 80% of America's bonded whiskey. The limestone filtered water of the Kentucky River produced the finest bourbon on earth. George bought up more distilleries, warehouses, and pharmacies. He even owned the Fleischmann Distillery. He shipped to speakeasies in Chicago, New York, Detroit, and beyond. Local officials were on the payroll. Small towns across the river in Kentucky became wide open drinking towns with casinos and brothels. He created a network that insiders called the Circle. One of his most famous operations was at Death Valley Farm on Queen City Avenue in Westwood. Outwardly, it was just a quiet property, but inside the attic held a still, dumbwaiters that carried barrels downstairs, and a hidden basement trap door which opened onto a 50 to 100-foot tunnel leading to waiting trucks. His employees would hijack his own legal shipments, divert the whiskey, and sell it on the black market at massive markups. In less than 3 years, George controlled roughly 35% of the nation's liquor. Remus controlled an empire that stretched across 9 states. With his right-hand man, George Connors, he employed 3,000 people. He had truck drivers, armed guards, accountants, lawyers, and like I said, he he had politicians on the take. George Remus, the dude who never touched a drop of alcohol in his life, had become the undisputed king of the bootleggers on land, and he lived like one. At his peak, he was worth $40 million, the equivalent of roughly $350 million today. He lived in a marble mansion on Price Hill, nicknamed the Marble Palace. It was a showplace of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and imported European art, complete with a $125,000 swimming pool. George threw a legendary party for 100 of the city's most prominent couples. The price of admission was $1,000 a plate. Every man received a diamond stick pin or a gold watch. Every woman received the keys to a brand new car parked outside. Guests lit their own cigars with $100 bills. There were electric baths, orchestras, and aquatic dancers in daring bathing suits. George stood at the center of it all, speaking of himself in the third person. Emma Jean was the perfect partner for the spectacle. She loved the spotlight, and George, he adored her. He had lifted her from modest circumstances and given her a life of unimaginable luxury. He trusted her completely. That trust would destroy him. He operated in plain sight, protected by bribes that allegedly reached the highest levels of government. So life was good. It was golden. But the empire was too big to ignore forever. In 1925, federal agents finally caught up with him. A young, ambitious prosecutor named Mabel Walker Willebrandt was sent from Washington to clean up the corruption in Cincinnati. You remember Mabel. I mentioned her in Bill McCoy's story. She was out for blood. One of her best agents was Franklin L. Dodge Jr. He headed up the investigation. George was indicted on thousands of counts of violating the Volstead Act. The trial was swift, and he was convicted in under 2 hours and sentenced to 2 years in the Atlanta, Georgia Federal Penitentiary. As he prepared to enter prison, he did what any man in love might do. He signed over power of attorney to his wife, Emma Jean. She would manage the distilleries, the warehouses, the bank accounts, the entire operation while he was gone. George trusts you with everything, he told her. She was supposed to watch over the empire like a hawk. He entered the pen in early 1925. The first few months were tolerable, but prison wasn't a country club, and George was still a man of means and influence. He kept in touch with Emma Jean through letters, and occasionally she visited. Business continued, on paper at least. Remus befriended another inmate and eventually confided in him that his wife, Emma Jean, had control over his money. But the inmate was an undercover prohibition agent named Franklin Dodge. You remember the federal prohibition agent, the rising star in the Bureau, handpicked by the Assistant Attorney General, Mabel Willebrandt? He was there to gather information. Instead of reporting the information, he quit his job. While George was locked up, Dodge began visiting Emma Jean on official business. The visits became personal, very personal. The undercover agent who once posed near George in prison to gather information now found himself falling for the bootlegger's wife. Or perhaps it was the fortune that drew him in. Either way, The affair began, and the two lived openly in the marble palace. Then rumors started filtering in. When George finally reached word of what had happened, he was stunned. He confronted Imogene in letters, so she sent him a lousy $100 from his vast empire. But something worse was brewing. Imogene and Dodge plotted to have George deported back to Germany. Then they decided to hire a hitman for $15,000 to kill him once he was released. The assassin, fearing a double cross, warned George instead. In the spring of 1927, George Remus completed his 2-year federal sentence and a short additional stretch in a county jail in Portsmouth, Ohio. He walked out of prison a free man. He returned to the Price Hill estate, assuming he'd reclaim his kingdom. Instead, he found an empty shell. Every stick of furniture was gone. Paintings had been stripped from the walls. Books were piled on the floor, along with a cot, a table, and a chair. Imogene and Dodge liquidated everything. They sold off his distilleries, they transferred whiskey certificates, they drained his bank accounts, and hid his fortunes. Furniture, paintings, silver, even the plates, everything of value disappeared. The man who had millions now owned almost nothing. The betrayal cut deeper than losing the money. The woman he had loved, elevated, and trusted had taken everything. She shared it with the federal agent who had helped put him behind bars. The underworld whispered about the affair. His reputation, his pride, his empire were all gone. Something inside George snapped. He became obsessed. For weeks, he followed Imogene. He watched her move through the city in his old cars, wearing the jewelry he had bought her. On the morning of October 6th, 1927, he learned she was heading to the courthouse to finalize the divorce. He spotted her leaving the Elms Hotel with her daughter Ruth. From inside his limousine, he ordered his driver to follow her. What happened in Eden Park unfolded in broad daylight in front of witnesses. The chase, the car ramming, the gunshot. George never denied pulling the trigger. At the police station, he was calm, almost relieved. He told detectives the full story of betrayal, how Imogene and Dodge had robbed him blind, how they had tried to have him killed, how the humiliation had become unbearable. Imogene died within 2 hours after the shooting in a Cincinnati hospital. The murder trial that followed was one of the most sensationalized in the 1920s in America. The nation went wild. Newspapers from New York to Los Angeles splashed the story across front pages. Bootleg King murders wife in park. Remus guns down Imogene in broad daylight. It began on November 14th, 1927 in Cincinnati. The prosecutor was none other than Charles Phelps Taft II, the 30-year-old son of the former President William Howard Taft. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from across the country filled the press benches. George Remus, true to form, was determined to defend himself alongside his attorney. For weeks, the courtroom became a stage. George wore a smart suit, and questioned witnesses like a master conductor. He cross-examined Franklin Dodge with withering intensity, forcing the former agent to admit details of the affair and the liquidation of his assets. The defense called witnesses who testified to the persecution and dismantling of his life, the years in prison, the stolen fortune, the plot to deport him and kill him. He pleaded not guilty by reason of transitory, maniacal insanity, the very defense he had pioneered years earlier as a lawyer. He argued that the shock of his wife's adultery, the theft, and public humiliation had driven him into a temporary state of madness at the exact moment he fired the shot. He was sane before and sane after, but in that instant in Eden Park, his mind had snapped. His first wife and daughter testified on his behalf, but Ruth, Imogene's daughter, testified against him, calling him abusive. The prosecution brought in psychiatrists who insisted that Remus was sane. Remus countered with his own experts. George took the stand and calmly explained how 2 years of torment and betrayal could unhinge even the strongest mind. The jury of 10 men and 2 women listened to every word. On December 20th, 1927, after hearing weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 19 minutes. They returned with a verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. The courtroom erupted. George walked away from a murder charge in one of the most public killings imaginable. But the story wasn't over. The jury had found him insane at the time of the crime, so the state of Ohio committed him to the Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane. Prosecutors were furious. They spent the whole trial insisting that he was perfectly sane and therefore fully responsible. Their expert psychiatrists had said as much. Now that same finding was used against them. George spent the next 6 to 7 months at Lima. He planted an apple orchard that he jokingly called the Remus Grove. He earned the nickname Johnny Appleseed among the staff. Legal battles followed. His lawyers filed habeas corpus petitions, and appeals flew back and forth. On March 30th of 1928, an appeals court ruled 2-1 in his favor. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld the decision 4-3 on June 19th, 1928. George walked out of the asylum a free man once again. The man got away with murder. He never rebuilt his bootlegging empire. The violence of the later Prohibition years disgusted him. He moved across the river to Covington, Kentucky. In later years, he took a third wife, his longtime secretary, Blanche Watson, and he ran a small contracting business as well as tutoring young lawyers informally. The man who had once lit cigars with $100 bills now lived quietly and modestly. He suffered a stroke in August of 1950, which left him needing constant care. He spent his final 2 years in a Covington boarding house with a nurse. George Remus died on January 20th, 1952, at the age of 73. He was buried at Riverside Cemetery in Falmouth, Kentucky, beside Blanche. In the years since, historians and writers have debated his place in American legend. Some say the larger-than-life bootlegger with the extravagant lifestyle and the tragic end, inspired F. Scott Fitzgerald's character, Jay Gatsby. Others point out that Remus was far more colorful than any fictional character. He blurred the lines between lawman and outlaw, genius and madman. He exploited Prohibition's own contradictions, turning the government's medicinal loophole into an illegal empire, only to be destroyed by a woman he loved and the federal agent who is supposed to uphold the law. The use of the temporary insanity defense in a murder case made legal history. In the Roaring '20s, George Remus, a man who bucked the system, proved the greatest fortunes could be built on legal technicalities, and the greatest falls could come from the intimate, brutal betrayal of one person you trust. Imogene, she was a thief, but no matter what, he took her life, and there's no debating that. Thanks for watching.